Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we shine a light on the strength of the human spirit and the need for accountability in times of injustice. Today, we explore a powerful story of an elderly man's unexpected arrest and the shocking truth that turned an entire town upside down. Let's dive in. It was a peaceful morning in the small town of Fairview, one of those sleepy suburban places where life moved at its own unhurried pace. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of soft orange and gold. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds and the distant hum of passing cars. It was the kind of place where people prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, where strangers were immediately noticed. But this morning, a man who wasn't a familiar face walked along those quiet streets. William Carter, an elderly black man with a thoughtful demeanor, was dressed in simple clothing, a brown jacket and a pair of well-worn shoes. To any onlooker, he seemed unremarkable, just another man out for a morning walk. Yet William Carter was far from ordinary. He was the sitting governor of the state, a man who had spent decades fighting for justice and equality. William had chosen to visit Fairview without an entourage, without the trappings of power that usually surrounded him. There were no security details, no fanfare, and no attention drawn to his presence. It wasn't the first time he had done this. For years, William had made it a point to connect with the communities he served, not as a politician, but as a man who wanted to understand their lives and struggles. This morning's walk was part of that tradition, an unannounced visit to a town far from the capital, a way to ground himself in the reality of his constituents' lives. The streets of Fairview were lined with well-maintained homes, each with a neatly trimmed lawn and a white picket fence. It was the picture of suburban tranquility. William walked with his hands in his pockets, his mind deep in thought. He had seen so much in his lifetime: marches, protests, victories, and setbacks. His heart carried the weight of history, and his mind was always churning, always thinking about what more could be done. As he turned onto Maplewood Drive, he noticed how still the neighborhood was. Curtains were drawn, and most homes seemed quiet, their residents likely still asleep. William appreciated the solitude. It was a rare moment for him to reflect without interruption. But while William saw tranquility, Officer Jake Reynolds saw suspicion. Reynolds was a young, ambitious officer in the Fairview Police Department. He prided himself on being diligent, on maintaining order. But over the years, his outlook had hardened. He had grown up in a system that taught him to view certain people as threats. And in this quiet, predominantly white town, an older black man walking alone on the street stood out to him like a sore thumb. Reynolds was driving slowly down the street in his patrol car when he first spotted William. He felt a flicker of unease. Who was this man? What is he doing here? His mind quickly filled with assumptions. Reynolds had seen enough incidents in his time to convince himself that being overly cautious was justified. Without a second thought, he turned on his patrol lights and pulled to the curb. The sudden flash of red and blue startled William. He stopped walking and turned to face the officer, his expression calm but curious. Reynolds stepped out of his car, his movements deliberate, his hand resting on his baton. "Excuse me, sir," Reynolds said, his tone sharp, almost commanding. "Can I see some identification?" William's brow furrowed slightly, but his demeanor remained steady. "Good morning, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned William, looking for anything that seemed off. To him, the mere presence of this man in this neighborhood was enough to warrant suspicion. He stiffened, his posture radiating authority. "ID now," he repeated, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. William nodded and reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly. "Of course," he said, his tone measured. But before he could retrieve his wallet, Reynolds' suspicions flared. In his mind, slow movements equaled danger. Without warning, he grabbed William's arm, yanking him roughly. "What are you doing?" William exclaimed, his voice tinged with surprise but not fear. He tried to maintain his balance as Reynolds pulled him closer. "You're under arrest for suspicious activity," Reynolds muttered, reaching for his handcuffs. "For what?" William asked, stunned. His voice carried a mix of disbelief and indignation. "I'm just taking a walk." Reynolds didn't respond. He had already made up his mind about William long before the conversation began. To him, this was just another routine stop, another form to fill out, another suspect to process. He didn't ask for William's name or his purpose for being there. None of it mattered. The cuffs snapped shut around William's wrists, cold and unyielding. A wave of humiliation washed over him as he stood on the sidewalk. Now treated as a criminal in a town he had come to understand and connect with. Yet William remained composed. He had faced worse in his lifetime: the insults, the violence, the systemic injustices. But this moment, small as it was, felt particularly sharp. To anyone watching, it would have been an unremarkable scene, a man being arrested on a quiet street. But a few passersby noticed. Some stopped to record the encounter on their phones, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger. William looked around, catching the eyes of a woman filming from her front porch. He saw the shock in her expression, the unspoken words of outrage. He realized, even in this moment of personal humiliation, that this was about more than just him. It was a reflection of a system that judged people like him not by their character or actions, but by the color of their skin. Reynolds, oblivious to the weight of what he had just done, led William to the patrol car. His chest puffed out with a sense of accomplishment. He opened the car door and gestured for William to get in. Before stepping inside, William turned his head slightly, meeting Reynolds' eyes. His voice was calm, but his words were laced with quiet authority. "You have no idea who you've just arrested." Reynolds froze for a brief second, his grip tightening on the cuffs. There was something about William's tone, measured and deliberate, that unsettled him. But Reynolds quickly dismissed the feeling. He was doing his job, or so he thought. As the car door shut, the quiet streets of Fairview seemed to hold their breath, unaware that this small act of injustice would soon ignite a firestorm that would reach far beyond the town's borders. In the distance, the faint hum of voices began to rise, a harbinger of the storm to come. The ride to the Fairview police station was a quiet one, but the silence was anything but peaceful. In the back seat, William Carter sat calmly, his hands cuffed in front of him, his gaze fixed on the town passing by outside the window. He wasn't angry, at least not in the explosive, immediate way most people would expect. Instead, he felt a familiar, deep-seated frustration, the kind that simmered over years of witnessing injustice. As the car approached the station, William thought about all the people who would never get the chance to challenge a system that saw them as lesser. This wasn't just about him. He had spent his life fighting against this kind of treatment. And yet, here he was, a governor, a man who had walked in the halls of power, reduced to being another statistic in the eyes of someone who hadn't even bothered to ask for his name. Officer Jake Reynolds, on the other hand, felt none of this weight. To him, this was routine. He parked his patrol car in front of the station and opened the door for William to step out. There was no acknowledgement of William as anything more than a suspect. No inkling that this moment would soon spiral out of his control. Inside the station, the atmosphere was indifferent, almost mechanical. Officers moved about their tasks, barely glancing at William as Reynolds led him through the doors. For them, this was just another day, another man being processed. No one questioned the arrest. No one thought to ask why an elderly black man had been brought in on such vague charges. Reynolds escorted William to the booking area, where a desk officer began the standard procedure. William remained composed, answering the officer's questions with calm precision. But when asked for his name, he paused for a moment. A part of him wanted to see how far this would go, how deep the assumptions would run. "William Carter," he said finally, his voice steady. The desk officer froze mid-typing, his eyes flicking up from the computer. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of recognition, but the officer quickly masked it, finishing the entry as if nothing unusual had happened. To him, surely this couldn't be the William Carter, the governor. What would a man like that be doing here? Dressed like this? Meanwhile, outside the station, the seeds of outrage had already begun to sprout. The video of William's arrest had spread rapidly on social media. shared and reshared with captions like elderly black man arrested for walking in a white neighborhood, and when will this stop? People across the state, and even beyond, were beginning to take notice. In Fairview, a small crowd had started to gather near the station. A few concerned citizens, angered by what they had seen online, stood holding their phones aloft, recording their own footage of the growing tension. Some held signs hastily scrawled with phrases like "Justice for all" and "End racism now." What began as a few voices murmuring indignation soon grew into a chorus of chants, demanding answers. Back inside, Reynolds was oblivious to the storm brewing outside. He was writing up his report, his pen scratching against the paper in short, sharp strokes. But as he wrote, something gnawed at the edges of his mind. It wasn't just the way William had carried himself, with dignity. Even in handcuffs, it wasn't just his calm, cutting words. "You have no idea who you've just arrested." It was the sense that something about this situation didn't feel right. Reynolds tried to push the thought aside, focusing on the paperwork. He had done this 100 times before. Why should this time be any different? But the unease refused to be ignored. He looked up at the desk officer, who had been unusually quiet since entering William's information into the system. "Anything wrong?" Reynolds asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The desk officer hesitated, his gaze flicking toward William, who sat calmly in a chair nearby, his hands still cuffed. "You said his name's William Carter?" the officer asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Reynolds replied, frowning. "Why?" The desk officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice further. "You sure you don't want to check that name again? You might have just arrested the governor." Reynolds blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "The governor?" His voice was incredulous, almost scoffing. "Come on, that's impossible." But the words hung in the air, refusing to be dismissed. Reynolds' stomach churned as doubt began to creep in. He looked back at William, who had been sitting quietly, watching the exchange with a faint, knowing smile. The desk officer quickly tapped on his keyboard, pulling up the record. When the screen loaded, his face paled. He turned the monitor toward Reynolds. "Take a look for yourself," he said grimly. Reynolds stepped closer, his eyes scanning the information on the screen. His breath caught in his throat. There it was, in black and white, William Carter, governor of the state of state name. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Reynolds felt the weight of what he had done crash down on him. The calm confidence he had carried all morning evaporated, replaced by a sickening realization. "I didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't realize." The desk officer leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Well, you've realized now, and if the crowd outside is anything to go by, the whole state's about to find out too." Reynolds turned toward the window, noticing for the first time the growing noise outside. He walked over and pulled back the curtain slightly. What he saw made his stomach drop. A crowd had gathered, dozens of people, maybe more, holding signs, chanting, their voices rising with anger and urgency. News vans had started to arrive, reporters setting up cameras to broadcast the scene. Reynolds let the curtain fall back into place. He felt his chest tighten as panic set in. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was a catastrophe, and it was only the beginning. Inside the Fairview police station, the atmosphere had shifted from routine indifference to an oppressive tension that was impossible to ignore. Officers moved about with unease, stealing glances toward the window where muffled chants from the growing crowd seeped into the building. What had started as a handful of onlookers had swelled into a significant demonstration. The once quiet suburban street now buzzed with the sound of voices united in outrage. William Carter, seated calmly in the corner of the station, remained an island of composure amidst the rising chaos. He had been released from the cuffs after his identity was confirmed, but the humiliation of the arrest still lingered in the air. He observed the room with a sharp, discerning eye, noticing the subtle shifts in behavior, the stiffness in the officers' movements, the quick exchanges of worried whispers. Despite the circumstances, William felt no need to lash out. He had long since learned that anger, when wielded impulsively, often led to less change than measured resolve. Instead, His thoughts turned to the broader implications of this moment. The faces of the people outside, their chants growing louder, were a reminder that this wasn't just about him. It was about a system that had been broken for too long. Across the room, Officer Jake Reynolds sat at his desk, staring blankly at his report. His pen rested loosely in his hand, unmoving. The realization that he had arrested the sitting governor of the state, without cause, without even a basic inquiry, gnawed at him. Every moment replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. His decision to stop William, his aggressive tone, the handcuffs. He hadn't even asked for the man's name before assuming the worst. Reynolds glanced toward William, who met his gaze briefly before looking away. The governor's calm demeanor wasn't comforting. It was unnerving. It carried an unspoken message. You've made a grave mistake, and now you must face it. Reynolds, a voice barked, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Chief Douglas Harper, a seasoned officer with a grizzled beard and a no-nonsense demeanor. The chief's face was grim as he approached. My office. Now. Reynolds nodded mutely and followed the chief down the hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last, the noise of the crowd outside growing louder as they passed the windows. When they reached the office, the chief shut the door behind them and turned to face Reynolds, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. Do you have any idea what you've done? The chief began, his voice low but charged with fury. Do you understand the position you've put this department in? Reynolds swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't know he was the governor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You thought, the chief interrupted, his tone sharp. You thought an elderly black man walking in a neighborhood didn't belong there? That he must be up to something? And you didn't even bother to ask him a single question before cuffing him? Reynolds felt the words hit him like blows. I made a mistake, he admitted, his voice cracking. This isn't just a mistake. Reynolds, the chief snapped, leaning forward. This is a disaster. There's a crowd outside demanding answers. The media is already here, and the governor of our state is sitting in my station because of your mistake. Do you have any idea what this means for us? For you. Reynolds didn't answer. What could he say? Every instinct told him to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant any harm. But deep down, he knew those defenses wouldn't hold. His actions had been guided by assumptions he hadn't even realized he held, biases that now stood exposed in the harsh light of this moment. The chief sighed heavily and sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. We're going to release him immediately. Of course, but that won't be enough. This is going to blow up in our faces. And the department's reputation, your reputation, isn't going to survive this. Reynolds nodded stiffly. What do I do? He asked, his voice small. The chief looked at him with a mix of pity and frustration. You're suspended indefinitely. Effective immediately. Go home. Reynolds, stay out of the way. We'll deal with the fallout. Reynolds opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. Instead, he nodded silently and left the office. The hallway felt colder as he walked back toward the main room, his colleagues' eyes tracking him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He avoided their gazes, keeping his head down as he approached his desk. William was still seated in the corner, now speaking quietly with one of the station's senior officers. He looked up as Reynolds approached, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, Reynolds stammered, the words tumbling out awkwardly. It was a weak apology, and they both knew it. William regarded him for a long moment, his gaze steady. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. Sorry doesn't fix the problem. Officer Reynolds, it's a start, but it's not the solution. Reynolds nodded, unable to meet William's eyes. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, suffocating. He turned and walked toward the exit, each step feeling heavier than the last. Outside, the scene was chaotic. The crowd had grown larger, spilling into the street. News vans lined the block, reporters speaking into cameras as they narrated the unfolding story. Protesters held signs that read "Justice for all" and "No more injustice." The chants were deafening now, a unified cry for accountability. Reynolds paused at the door, taking in the scene. He had spent years thinking of himself as a protector, a servant of justice. But now, standing in the eye of the storm he had created, he realized how far he had strayed from that ideal. As he stepped into the crowd, the chants grew louder, their message clear: change is coming. The crowd outside the Fairview police station was no longer just a collection of individuals. It had become a movement. Protesters of all ages and races stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices raised in chants that echoed through the streets. Signs bobbed in the air, reading messages like "Justice for Governor Carter" and "End Police Bias." News cameras panned across the growing demonstration, broadcasting the scene to audiences across the country. What had started as a single act of injustice had snowballed into a flashpoint for systemic change. Inside the station, Governor William Carter sat in a small, uncomfortable chair in the waiting area. He had been formally released, but he had no intention of leaving just yet. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the turmoil outside. His staff was already on their way, alerted to his situation by the viral videos and the subsequent media frenzy. But for now, he waited, quietly observing the chaos that had unfolded around him. Officers moved nervously through the station, their usual routines disrupted by the noise and tension. The chants from the crowd outside were a constant reminder of the mistake that had brought them to this moment. Conversations were hushed, their tones anxious. No one wanted to acknowledge the elephant in the room. The department's integrity had been shattered. William watched as an officer nervously approached him, clearly uncomfortable. "Governor Carter," the young man said, clearing his throat. "Would you like some water or anything else?" William smiled faintly and shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, his voice steady. There was no malice in his tone, only a quiet resolve that made the officer fidget before retreating. Meanwhile, in the chief's office, Chief Douglas Harper stood at his desk, staring out the window at the crowd. The chants were growing louder, the signs more plentiful. Harper turned to his deputy, Karen Fields, who was standing nearby, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "This is out of control," Harper muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "We need to address this before it gets worse." Fields, a pragmatic woman known for her level-headedness, nodded. "We're already past the point of no return," she said. "The media is everywhere, and the story's gone national. Whatever we do next needs to be calculated. No room for errors." Harper sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Have we drafted the apology yet?" Fields nodded. "Yes, but it won't be enough. Not with the governor sitting out there waiting to speak to someone in charge." Harper glanced toward the door, his stomach churning. This is a nightmare. Back in the waiting area, Jake Reynolds lingered near the corner, watching the scene unfold. Stripped of his uniform and his badge, he felt like a shadow of the officer he had been only hours earlier. His suspension had been swift, but the weight of what he had done hung heavier than any official reprimand. The sight of William Carter, calm and dignified despite the humiliation he'd endured, only deepened Reynolds' shame. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Reynolds hesitantly walked over to William. He stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure how to begin. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Governor Carter," he started, his words halting. "I want to apologize. Again, I know it doesn't fix anything, but—" William looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "But you're saying it anyway," he finished for him. Reynolds nodded, his face flushed. "Yes." There was a long pause as William regarded the younger man. "Do you know why what you did was wrong?" he asked finally, his tone calm but firm. Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it again. He thought about the assumptions he had made, the snap judgments that had led him to cuff an innocent man. I acted on bias," he admitted. "I didn't stop to think. I just reacted." William nodded slowly. "That's a start," he said. "But recognizing the problem is only the first step. What you do next matters more." Reynolds looked down at his hands, which trembled slightly. "I don't even know where to begin." William leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You begin by listening, by understanding that this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been judged, dismissed, or mistreated because of the way they look. You've seen the crowd outside. This moment is bigger than you or me." Reynolds followed William's gaze toward the window, where the protest continued to swell. The noise was deafening now, the chants a constant reminder of the anger and pain that had been ignited by his actions. He swallowed hard, the enormity of the situation settling in his chest like a stone. Outside, the demonstration had reached a fever pitch. The streets were packed with people, and more were arriving by the minute. News anchors reported live from the scene, their voices competing with the chants. One anchor spoke directly into the camera, her tone urgent. "This protest has grown exponentially in the past few hours," she said. "What began as a local incident has become a national conversation about systemic bias in policing. Protesters are calling for accountability and meaningful reform, and they show no signs of slowing down." At the heart of the crowd, a young woman stood on a makeshift platform, holding a megaphone. Her voice rang out over the din, her words charged with passion. "This isn't just about Governor Carter," she shouted, her tone fierce. "This is about every person who has been judged, harassed, or treated like they don't belong because of the color of their skin. We're here to say, enough is enough." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants rising to a crescendo. Inside the station, the officers could feel the walls almost vibrating from the noise. The tension was palpable, a storm ready to break. William Carter remained seated, his expression thoughtful. He had faced moments like this before, moments where change felt within reach, but also perilously fragile. He knew that what happened next would determine whether this moment would spark meaningful action or fade into just another headline. As the protest raged outside and the tension simmered inside, the lines between right and wrong, justice and injustice, became clearer than ever. The tipping point had been reached, and there was no turning back. The roar of the crowd outside the Fairview police station was deafening now, a tide of voices united in their demand for justice. Inside, the tension was a living thing, pressing against the walls like an unstoppable force. Officers exchanged nervous glances, some huddling near the windows, others pretending to focus on their tasks. Governor William Carter, still seated in the waiting area, radiated a calm authority that stood in stark contrast to the chaos around him. He had spoken only briefly to the officers who processed his release, offering measured words that carried no anger, only truth. He understood the weight of this moment, not just for himself, but for the thousands outside who saw his experience as a reflection of their own. The door to the chief's office opened abruptly, and Chief Douglas Harper stepped out, followed by Deputy Karen Fields. Their expressions were grave, their movements deliberate. All eyes turned to them as they approached William. "Governor Carter," Chief Harper began, his voice steady but strained. "Your staff has arrived. They're waiting to escort you home. On behalf of this department, I'd like to extend my sincerest apologies." William interrupted, his tone polite but pointed. He stood slowly, his tall frame commanding the room's attention. "Chief Harper, this is about far more than an apology. I hope you realize that." The chief nodded, visibly uncomfortable. "Yes, sir, I do. We're prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation and to implement whatever changes are necessary." William studied him for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "Good," he said finally. "But let me be clear. Words mean nothing without action. The people outside aren't just chanting for me. They're chanting for themselves, for their children, for their communities. What happens here today will echo far beyond this town." Before Harper could respond, the front doors of the station swung open, and a group of people entered. Among them were William's aides, their faces a mix of relief and determination. One of them approached William, whispering briefly in his ear. He nodded, then turned back to the chief. "I'm leaving now," he said, "but I'll be back." "This isn't the end of the conversation. It's the beginning." Harper nodded solemnly. "Understood, Governor." As William made his way toward the door, he paused briefly beside Officer Jake Reynolds, who stood near the edge of the room, his face pale, his expression one of quiet torment. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then William placed a hand on Reynolds' shoulder. Change starts with acknowledgement, he said softly. You've taken the first step. Now take the next one. Reynolds looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. He nodded silently, his throat too tight to speak. William stepped out into the sunlight, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and chants of "Justice for Carter" filled the air. But the governor raised a hand, and gradually the noise subsided. Standing on the steps of the station, William looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, all united by a shared purpose. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice carrying over the crowd like a beacon. "This moment isn't just about me," he began. "It's about all of us. It's about the countless lives disrupted, the opportunities stolen, and the trust broken by a system that has failed to treat everyone equally. Today, we've seen how deeply these issues run, but we've also seen something else, the power of people coming together to demand better." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in agreement. William waited for the noise to settle before continuing. "Real change doesn't come from anger alone," he said. "It comes from determination, from unity, and from action. I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. But I can't do it alone. Change requires all of us, holding our leaders accountable, challenging our institutions, and demanding justice every single day." The crowd erupted again, their cheers filling the streets. William stepped down from the platform, walking toward the car that was waiting to take him back to the Capitol. As he climbed into the back seat, he glanced out the window one last time, taking in the sight of the protesters who had come to his defense. It wasn't just a crowd, it was a movement, and it was only just beginning. The aftermath of that day in Fairview rippled far and wide. The viral video of Governor William Carter's arrest became a rallying cry for justice, sparking protests across the state and beyond. The incident reignited conversations about systemic bias in policing, prompting calls for reform at every level of government. Within weeks, Fairview's police department underwent a thorough investigation. Officer Jake Reynolds, while suspended indefinitely, chose to publicly address his actions. In a heartfelt statement, he acknowledged the biases that had guided his decisions and committed to undergoing training on racial sensitivity and systemic injustice. Governor Carter, true to his word, spearheaded new legislation aimed at addressing the root causes of racial profiling. His efforts led to the establishment of independent oversight committees, mandatory bias training for law enforcement, and community-driven reforms designed to rebuild trust between police departments and the neighborhoods they served. But the changes didn't stop with policy. The people of Fairview, inspired by what had happened in their small town, formed grassroots organizations dedicated to fostering dialogue and understanding between different communities. What had begun as a moment of outrage transformed into a sustained effort to build a more equitable future. As for William Carter, he continued his work with renewed purpose. The memory of that morning in Fairview stayed with him, a reminder of both the challenges that remained and the resilience of the human spirit. He often thought about the young people in the crowd that day, their faces alight with hope and determination. They were the ones who would carry the torch forward, ensuring that the fight for justice would never waver. And though the road ahead was long, William knew one thing for certain: change was possible. It always had been. It just required the courage to begin. Thank you for watching this impactful story on Empathy Stories. This tale reminds us of the importance of standing against prejudice and striving for justice in every corner of society. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, uplift, and spark meaningful change. Together, we can build a future rooted in understanding and empathy. See you next time.